They said his war was already over. An active-duty Navy SEAL sent home early, carrying orders he followed, and a choice he never forgave himself for. In the frozen mountains of Idaho, during a blizzard, meant to wipe the world clean, he heard something he wasn't meant to hear. A military dog hanging from a wire. Broken. Shaking. Abandoned with a note that read, "Unstable." Not worth the risk. What passed between them in that first fragile moment would change them both. Because sometimes the miracles God sends don't come wrapped in light. They come in the lives the world decided to throw away. If this story moved you, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. Your single click truly means more than you know. God bless you for keeping hope alive. The blizzard came down hard, without warning, swallowing the northern Idaho mountains in white silence, where sound died quickly and distance lost all meaning beneath the falling snow. Jack Holloway slowed his truck to a crawl and pulled off near a half-buried Forest Service road, headlights cutting weak tunnels through the storm. At 36, Jack was built lean and hard, shoulders squared by years of combat loadouts, his movements economical even in exhaustion. His face carried sharp angles, a straight nose broken once long ago, a firm jaw shadowed by short, unshaven stubble, steel blue eyes that rarely rested. He was active-duty Navy SEAL, officially on mandatory leave after a failed operation overseas. Unofficially, he was a man who had not slept more than a few hours at a time in months. He shut off the engine and sat in the quiet hum of the storm, jaw tight, hands steady on the wheel. He told himself he had stopped only because visibility was gone. He did not admit that isolation felt safer than movement. The wind struck the truck broadside, rocking it slightly. Jack reached for his jacket when a sound slipped through the storm. Not wind, not shifting snow. A thin, broken noise barely audible, like breath scraping through ice. His body reacted before thought. He stepped out into knee-deep snow boots, finding traction by habit, eyes scanning tree lines and shadow. The sound came again, weaker this time. Jack followed it down slope toward a stand of cottonwoods near a frozen creek. Years of training sharpened his focus, filtering panic from curiosity. Whatever made that sound was alive, and alive meant unfinished. He saw it first as movement, a dark shape swaying against the white. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a dog. A large German shepherd, black-coated and skeletal beneath matted fur, hung from a steel cable looped cruelly around its neck. Its hind paws barely touched the ground, trembling claws scraping uselessly at frozen soil. Frost clung to its whiskers, its amber eyes wide and glassy with terror, locked onto Jack's, as if he were the last solid thing left in the world. A military collar hung loose against its chest, an old canine tag clinking faintly. Taped beneath it was a folded note, stiff with ice. Jack's breath caught hard. He stepped forward, hands shaking despite his control, and peeled the paper free. Unstable. Not worth the risk. The words blurred. He had seen language like this before on reports, on casualty assessments, on decisions that erased people with clean justification. He looked back at the dog. There was nothing feral in its eyes. Only fear. Only exhaustion. Something old and buried twisted violently inside Jack's chest, a memory of shouting over rotor noise of a teammate bleeding out while orders crackled through his headset. "Leave him. Pull back. Mission first." "I've got you, Jack," said aloud, voice low and steady the way he spoke to men pinned under fire. He slung his pack aside and climbed the tree boots, slipping against frozen bark. The dog wheezed, body convulsing as the cable tightened with each sway. Jack drew his knife, the same blade he had carried through deserts and cities, and slid it between steel and fur. His hands did not hesitate. One hard pull. The cable snapped. The dog dropped into his arms with a heavy, breathless thud, both of them collapsing into the snow. Jack rolled onto his side, cradling the animal against his chest, as the dog gasped violently, lungs fighting for air. Its body was all sharp bone and shuddering muscle, the heat of life barely holding. Jack pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's neck, grounding himself. Snow piled silently around them. The storm did not slow, but Jack Holloway stayed there, arms locked tight around the shaking form, making a decision he had waited years to make. This time no one was being left behind. Snow thickened as Jack Holloway carried the dog through the storm, the forest closing around them in white layers that erased tracks almost as quickly as they were made. The dog lay heavy in Jack's arms, all rigid muscle and fragile breath, its body shuddering with every uneven inhale. Jack adjusted his grip automatically, cradling the animal close to his chest, the way medics once carried wounded men off hot ground. The shepherd was large, even in its weakened state, likely 4 or 5 years old, black fur clumped with ice and dried blood. The steel burn around its neck was raw and swollen, the skin torn where the cable had bitten deep. Jack felt the rise and fall of the dog's ribs, shallow but present. Alive. That word repeated in his mind like a command. He moved fast boots breaking through drifts, shoulders burning as the weight settled into his muscles. He did not allow himself to think about how close the dog had been to dying, or how easily he might have arrived. Later, those thoughts were useless. Action was what mattered. The cabin appeared through the trees, its outline softened by snow, crouched low against the mountain, like something trying not to be seen. It belonged to Ben Mercer, a former teammate killed 2 years earlier during a mountain training accident overseas. Ben had been broad-shouldered and loud, a man with a thick beard and a laugh that filled rooms, the kind who talked easily to strangers and trusted too quickly. The cabin had been Ben's dream, a place to disappear after service. Jack had inherited it in silence. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. Jack kicked the door shut behind him and lowered the dog onto the wooden floor near the stone fireplace. He stripped off his gloves and jacket fingers already numb and went to work with practiced efficiency. He cleaned the wound with melted snow and antiseptic from his kit, jaw clenched, as the dog flinched weakly. Jack spoke quietly, not soothing, just steady. He pressed gauze against the torn skin, checked airway, monitored the dog's breath the way he once watched chest rise under body armor. His hands moved without hesitation, but his chest felt tight, crowded with memories that refused to stay buried. He remembered another body heavier than this one, bleeding out in a ravine, while extraction orders crackled through his earpiece. He remembered saying nothing, remembered obeying. The dog let out a low, broken sound as Jack wrapped a bandage loosely around its neck. Ranger Jack murmured without thinking the name leaving his mouth before he questioned it. A name meant assignment, belonging, something he had denied once before. Fire caught slowly flames licking at the cold air. Jack shrugged the dog closer to the warmth, wrapping it in an old wool blanket. Ranger's eyes flickered open, amber dulled by pain, but tracking Jack's movements with surprising focus. There was no aggression there, no wildness, only exhaustion and something like expectation. Jack sat back on his heels, hands resting uselessly on his thighs, and let the weight of the moment settle. He had been taught to separate emotion from action, but sitting there in the dim cabin, he felt both collide. He thought of the after-action report that had ended his last deployment. Clear language, clean conclusions, no space for hesitation. Ranger's breathing evened slightly. Jack felt his own breath hitch in response. Night pressed in quickly, the storm sealing the cabin off from the rest of the world. Jack stayed close, checking Ranger's pulse, adding wood to the fire, refusing sleep. Every sound outside tightened something in his spine. He replayed the mission again and again, adjusting variables that no longer mattered. What if he had waited? What if he had ignored the order? What if he had moved faster? Ranger shifted a soft whine escaping its throat, and Jack's attention snapped back to the present. He rested a hand against the dog's shoulder, feeling heat muscle life. "You're not alone," he said quietly, unsure who the words were meant for. By the time the storm eased slightly, Ranger's breathing had stabilized into a fragile rhythm. Jack leaned back against the wall, exhaustion finally creeping into his bones. He watched the firelight move across the cabin's rough timber, across Ben's old gear, stacked neatly in the corner. Jack understood something then, with a clarity that hurt. Saving Ranger would not erase what he had lost. It would not rewrite the past. But it was something real, something happening now. And for the first time since the mission that had broken him, Jack Holloway allowed himself to stay fully present with a life that depended on him. Night sealed the mountains in relentless wind and snow pressing against the cabin walls, until the darkness felt alive, listening, waiting for something inside to break. Jack Holloway sat awake on the cabin floor, back against the wall, boots still on. The fire burned low, its light, uneven shadows stretching too long across the ceiling. The storm outside found cracks in his mind and forced its way through. Wind became rotor wash. The groan of trees became distant explosions. His chest tightened until breath turned shallow and sharp. Jack's hands curled into fists without permission, muscles locking as memory took over. He was no longer in Idaho. He was back in the canyon dust, choking the air, his radio screaming orders he hadn't wanted to hear. "Leave him! Fall back!" Jack's jaw trembled as guilt surged hot and heavy. He tried grounding himself, naming objects in the room, but the darkness refused to loosen its grip. Panic wrapped around his ribs, squeezing until the present nearly disappeared. Ranger stirred near the fire. The dog's movements were slow and uneven, his injured body stiff with pain, but he rose anyway. He dragged himself across the wooden floor cloths, scraping softly, stopping only when his head reached Jack's boot. Ranger pressed his weight there, warm and solid breathing, shallow but steady. His fur was coarse beneath Jack's shaking fingers, black shot through with faint gray along the muzzle that suggested hard years rather than age. Ranger was young, maybe 4, but his eyes carried something older. Jack felt the contact pull him back inch by inch. He focused on the rhythm of the dog's breath, matching it, forcing his own lungs to follow. "Stay, Jack," whispered voice, rough. Ranger did not move. He stayed anchoring Jack to the floor, to the fire, to the fact that this night was not a battlefield. The knock came quietly at first, nearly lost beneath the storm. Jack's head snapped up, heart-hammering, as instinct surged. He moved without sound, reaching for the weapon he no longer carried, then stopping himself. The knock came again, firmer. Ranger lifted his head, but did not growl. Jack opened the door a crack. A woman stood on the porch, snow crusted into her jacket. Dark hair pulled into a low, practical braid. She was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with a pale, wind-burned face and eyes sharp with fatigue rather than fear. Her uniform marked her as a forest ranger. "Sorry," she said, voice steady but strained. "I've been tracking illegal traps." The storm cut me off. She introduced herself as Emily Carter. Her posture was cautious, respectful, the kind of woman who measured spaces before entering them. Jack nodded once and stepped aside. Emily stamped snow from her boots and took in the cabin with a quick, assessing glance. She noticed Ranger immediately, her expression tightening not with alarm, but recognition. She knelt slowly, keeping distance, her movements deliberate. "He's been through something," she said quietly. Emily had the look of someone used to long days outdoors, weathered skin, strong hands, a calm presence shaped by solitude and responsibility. She carried herself with restraint, the kind learned by people who spend more time observing than speaking. Jack watched her carefully, tension humming beneath his skin, but Ranger did not retreat. He remained where he was, eyes tracking Emily without panic. She met Jack's gaze. "I won't touch him," she said. "I just needed shelter." Jack nodded again. Words felt unnecessary. The three of them settled into an uneasy quiet. Emily warmed her hands near the fire, careful not to crowd the space. Jack returned to the wall, Ranger still pressed against him. Outside, the storm screamed, but inside something fragile held. Emily spoke softly about the traps she'd been following, about how cruelty often hid behind justifications. Jack listened without interrupting his attention, divided between her voice and the steady weight at his side. For the first time that night, the past loosened its grip. The darkness did not vanish, but it receded enough to breathe. Ranger shifted closer, his head resting against Jack's shin, a silent agreement to stay awake together. By the time the storm eased slightly, the cabin felt smaller but safer. Jack stared into the fire, exhaustion dragging at him. He did not sleep. He stayed present, counting breaths, aware of Emily's quiet vigilance and Ranger's steady warmth. This was not peace, but it was survival. And for now, that was enough. Morning came pale and uncertain, the storm retreating into the high ridges as Jack Holloway drove the truck down the mountain road toward town. Snow still clung to the shoulders, but the sky had lifted just enough to reveal distance again. Ranger lay on a thick blanket in the back seat, breathing steadier. Now amber eyes tracking motion through the rear window, without fear. Emily Carter rode in silence beside Jack, her posture upright, hands folded in her lap, the kind of stillness learned from long hours alone in the field. She was in her early 30s, tall and spare, dark hair pulled back cleanly, skin weathered by altitude and winter wind. She watched Ranger with the practiced calm of someone who read animals by what they did not do. Jack kept his eyes on the road, jaw set, aware of how much depended on what came next. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town, a low building with a faded red roof and windows fogged by warmth inside. Dr. Claire Halverson met them at the door, a woman in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair cropped short and a face shaped by years of hard truths. She was broad-shouldered, steady on her feet, her movements efficient without hurry. When she knelt to Ranger's level, she did not coo or reach. She observed. Her hands were scarred, and capable fingers thickened by work eyes sharp with experience. Ranger did not pull back. He stood quietly as Claire examined the rope burns, the healed scars beneath the coat, the tension held deep along the spine. "This isn't a dog that snapped," Claire said after a long moment, voice low. "This is a dog that was pushed." Jack felt something loosen in his chest as the words settled. Inside the clinic smelled of disinfectant and damp fur. Claire moved Ranger onto the table with practiced care, checking range of motion, listening to the heart tracing old injuries that told a longer story than any report. She spoke plainly, without drama. Ranger had been subjected to aversive training, excessive force punishment designed to break rather than guide. The hanging had not been discipline. It had been disposal. Jack stood rigid beside the table. Hands clenched, his mind flashing to language he recognized too well. Asset, liability, risk mitigation. Emily listened closely, his narrowing not in anger, but focus. She had been tracking a network of private handlers, supplying security dogs to anyone willing to pay, operating beyond oversight, moving animals across county lines. Ranger fit the pattern perfectly. Not a failure. A survivor. A bell chimed as the clinic door opened and a woman entered with a boy of about 8. The boy had sandy hair that stuck up at the crown and a cautious way of moving one hand tucked into his jacket pocket as if guarding something fragile. His mother hovered close, mid-30s, slight with tired eyes, and a scarf wound tight against the cold. The boy noticed Ranger first and froze. Claire watched him carefully. Ranger remained still, ears relaxed, posture neutral. The boy took a half-step forward, curiosity outweighing fear. "Is he mean?" he asked quietly. Jack held his breath. Ranger lowered his head slightly, a soft exhale fogging the air. The boy's shoulders eased. "No," Claire said. "He's hurt." The boy nodded, understanding the difference. Jack felt the truth of it land hard and clean. Emily met Jack's eyes, the implication unspoken. This dog was evidence, yes, but also a living counter-argument. Not a monster, not dangerous by nature, capable of restraint of trust even now. Claire finished bandaging and gave instructions in a tone that allowed no debate. Rest, warmth, no stress. She paused, then added, "He'll need time. And consistency." Jack nodded once. He had time. He would make it. They stepped back into the cold, with paperwork in hand, the town moving quietly around them as if unaware of what had been decided inside. Ranger climbed into the truck with help settling without complaint. Emily leaned against the door for a moment, scanning the street, thinking ahead. If Ranger had come from where she suspected others would follow, the network would not like scrutiny. Jack watched Ranger through the rearview mirror, the dog's eyes meeting his steady and present. For the first time since the canyon, Jack felt something like alignment. The road ahead was not easy, but it was clear. They drove back toward the mountains as the sun climbed weakly light, catching on snow like a promise that did not rush. Jack did not speak. Emily did not push. Ranger slept breath, even a life choosing to stay. And Jack Holloway understood with a certainty that did not waver that this was not a rescue that ended at the clinic door. This was a beginning, and it would require him to stand where he once stepped back. He tightened his grip on the wheel and drove on. The road climbed back toward the high pass, under a sky that had not yet decided whether to clear the snow along the shoulders packed hard and glittering like broken glass. Jack Holloway drove with both hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning terrain automatically, while Emily Carter watched the slopes with a ranger's vigilance. Ranger lay on the blanket in the back, still bandaged, still sore, but alert. His ears lifted and settled with the rhythm of the truck, his breathing calm. The world felt fragile in that quiet way Jack recognized from patrols when danger did not announce itself, but waited. He did not say it aloud, but he felt it in his bones before the sound came, a deep, muffled crack that rolled through the trees like distant thunder. They saw the slide moments later. A narrow chute had given way above the road, spilling a heavy tongue of snow and debris into the lower basin. A sedan sat half buried at the edge, rear lights blinking weakly through powder. Jack braked and pulled off without hesitation. Emily was already moving radio in hand, calling in coordinates with clipped precision. The wind carried a thin human sound from somewhere downslope. Jack's chest tightened. Ranger rose before being told pain-forgotten nose lifting to read the air. He whined once low, then leapt from the truck and plunged into the drift. Jack followed, boots sinking, breath burning. "Mark," he shouted, voice carrying command without force. Ranger cut left, then stopped abruptly, head down, tail rigid. He pawed once, then looked back. Jack dropped to his knees and dug. The snow was dense and cold, every scoop a fight. Jack fell into a familiar rhythm, assigning tasks without needing an audience. Emily moved to the vehicle, checking stability scanning for secondary slide risk. From the driver's side window, a woman's hand appeared shaking. The woman was in her early 40s, dark hair matted with snow, face pale but conscious. Her husband was trapped farther downslope with their 2 children, a boy and a girl, both young enough that fear had gone quiet and dangerous. Ranger barked once, not panic, but location, and shifted his stance, guiding Jack to where the boy lay under a shallow pocket. Jack cleared airways, wrapped a jacket around the child, handed him off to Emily, and moved again. The girl came next, crying thinly alive. The father was last, shoulder-pinned, breath shallow. Jack stabilized him with the same economy he used under fire, speaking clearly, keeping the man awake until help arrived. Sirens cut through the trees, muffled by snow. The family was loaded and moved hands, clutching hands, eyes wide with shock and relief. Ranger stood apart, chest-heaving blood seeping through the edge of his bandage where he had pushed too hard. The woman found Jack's sleeve with numb fingers. "That dog," she said, voice breaking. He found them. Jack nodded once, unable to trust his voice. He knelt beside Ranger and pressed his forehead to the dog's neck, grounding himself in the heat and life there. The wind carried the scene downhill toward town. By the time they reached the outskirts, word had already moved ahead of them. A deputy waved them through at a roadblock, eyes flicking to Ranger with something like disbelief. At the volunteer station, faces turned, then softened. Someone whispered. Someone else said it louder. The dog they found hanging. The dog that saved a family. Jack felt the shift, as a physical thing, a pressure easing where judgment had once lived. Emily stood beside him, her expression measured but satisfied. Evidence did not always look like paperwork. Sometimes it breathed. They returned to the cabin as dusk approached the light, thinning and blue. Jack cleaned Ranger's wound again, careful hands. Sure. Ranger endured without complaint, eyes on Jack's face trust, unforced. Jack realized then that the tightness he had carried since the canyon had loosened just a fraction. He had arrived in time. He had listened. He had acted. No one had been left behind. Outside the mountain settled snow, creaking as it cooled. Inside, a man and a dog shared the quiet aftermath of having chosen forward motion when it mattered. Night returned with a sharper edge, wind worrying the eaves as snow began to fall again, lighter than before, but persistent, tapping the cabin like fingers testing a locked door. Jack Holloway had just finished checking Ranger's bandage when headlights cut across the trees. They slowed, then stopped too close. Jack felt the old alertness rise clean and cold. Ranger lifted his head, ears forward, body still. Jack stepped to the window and saw the man get out, tall, broad, through the chest shoulders, hunched against the cold, moving with the stiff impatience of someone used to being obeyed. Mark Caldwell did not knock at first. He stood on the porch, as if claiming it, beard, dark, and untrimmed eyes, set deep beneath a heavy brow. He looked to be in his mid-40s face, weathered, but not by honest work, more by temper and neglect. His coat hung open despite the cold boots muddy with old snow. When he finally knocked, it was not a request. Jack opened the door enough to block the frame with his body. "That's my dog," Caldwell said, voice thick with certainty. "You found him. I want him back." His gaze slid past Jack and locked onto Ranger with something like ownership, not recognition. Ranger did not move. Jack felt the words hit places he had sealed years ago. Property. Asset. Recover. He kept his voice level. "He's not going anywhere." Caldwell's mouth twisted. He stepped forward, testing space. Ranger rose, then slow and deliberate, placing himself between Jack and the man. His posture was firm weight, forward tail low but steady. He did not bare his teeth. He warned. Caldwell scoffed. Unstable, he said, as if reciting a diagnosis. That thing snaps. Ranger held eyes fixed, breath even. Jack saw the truth in that stillness and felt something settle in him. This was control, not fear. Caldwell shoved at the door. Jack absorbed the movement, feet planted, muscle memory aligning his balance. The wind surged, snow blowing inside. Caldwell's hand shot out, grabbing at Ranger's collar. Ranger recoiled a half step, a startled sound breaking from his throat, then braced again, body shielding Jack. Jack's chest tightened, a flash of canyon walls, and shouted orders tearing through him. This time he did not freeze. He stepped forward and pushed Caldwell back onto the porch, voice cutting clean. "Get off my property." Caldwell laughed, sharp and brittle. "You think you can stop me? I trained him. I paid for him." The word paid tasted wrong in the air. Emily Carter's voice came from the kitchen, calm and precise, as she spoke into her radio. She stood near the counter, posture squared, eyes never leaving Caldwell. Her presence shifted the room, adding weight to Jack's refusal. Caldwell noticed her, then his bravado thinning. He opened his mouth to argue when a rock crashed through the side window glass, exploding inward. Ranger flinched at the sound, but did not charge. He planted himself harder, a living barrier. Snow blew across the floor. Caldwell reached again. Jack caught his wrist grip firm, but controlled, stopping short of violence. Outside, a siren rose and fell, distant but closing. The deputy arrived with another truck behind him, lights washing the cabin in blue and red. Caldwell backed away, cursing, hands raised in a show that came too late. Emily stepped outside with the deputy laying out what she had: reports, photos, GPS points of illegal traps, names tied to Caldwell's operation. The deputy listened, jaw tightening. Caldwell's protests unraveled under the weight of specifics. When the cuffs went on, his anger collapsed into disbelief. Ranger watched from the doorway, silent. Jack did not look away. He stayed present until Caldwell was gone. Headlights swallowed by the trees. The cabin felt different afterward, quieter but charged. Jack closed the door gently and leaned his forehead against it, breath finally steady. Ranger pressed into his leg, warm and solid, choosing contact. Jack knelt and rested his hands on the dog's shoulders, feeling the tremor fade. He understood what had changed. He had not retreated. He had not obeyed a bad order. He had stood. Outside, the storm moved on. Inside, the past loosened its hold, not erased, but answered. Spring arrived quietly in the mountains, not as a sudden change, but as a slow release. Snow thinned into water, water into dark soil, and the forest breathed again. Jack Holloway stood outside the cabin one morning, watching melt run down the grooves of old wood, feeling something inside him loosen with it. The past months had been heavy, full of vigilance and reckoning, but they had also been clear. Ranger sat beside him, larger now, stronger, the black of his coat, deep and healthy scars along his neck, softened by time. He was a working-line German shepherd in his prime, 5 years old, at most posture, balanced eyes alert but calm. The dog no longer startled at distant sounds. He read the world the way Jack did, carefully, without panic. They had become fluent in each other's silences. The call came 2 days later. Jack listened without interrupting, standing straight, weight evenly distributed, Ranger's shoulder brushing his leg, as if listening too. When the line went quiet, Jack closed his eyes for a moment. He had been cleared to return to duty, but with an option he hadn't expected, a pilot program pairing active duty operators with rehabilitated canines for combat stress support and advanced search work. It wasn't an escape from responsibility. It was a refinement of it. Jack thought of the canyon, the order he had followed, the choice he had lived with. He looked down at Ranger, who met his gaze steadily. "We'll do it," Jack said, voice even. Not a question. A decision. The base facility sat far from the noise of training fields bordered by trees rather than concrete. Jack reported in wearing his uniform again, the fit, familiar grounding. He moved through the corridors with a quiet confidence earned the hard way. Ranger walked at his side, leash loose, tail neutral presence, undeniable. The evaluation team watched closely. One of them, Lieutenant Harris, a compact man in his early 40s with close-cropped hair and a face etched by years of command, studied Ranger's movement and Jack's handling. Harris had the manner of someone who believed in data but respected instinct. "This isn't about turning him into something else," Harris said. "It's about letting him be what he is with the right structure." Jack nodded. Structure, he understood. Ranger passed every test without spectacle. He did not rush. He did not force contact. He assessed, responded, waited. When paired with a young operator who hadn't slept well in weeks, Ranger settled beside him and stayed. The man's shoulders lowered, his breathing slowed. No commands were given. No praise demanded. Jack watched from across the room, a warmth rising behind his ribs that surprised him. This was not heroism. It was presence, practiced and shared. Emily Carter visited the cabin that weekend before Jack left. She arrived in her Ranger truck, dust on the doors, hair pulled back as always, eyes bright with purpose. She looked thinner than before, not from strain, but momentum. Her investigation had expanded. Caldwell's arrest had opened doors that had been locked for years. She stood on the porch and took in the scene, Jack packing Ranger, waiting patiently. "You're doing the right thing," she said. Emily was not sentimental, but her voice carried certainty. She had always believed that change came from sustained attention, not grand gestures. They spoke briefly, easily about work and seasons and the way the mountains taught patience. When she left, she waved once, a clean, unambiguous goodbye. The months that followed were steady. Jack trained with Ranger daily, learning the subtle language between them, refining trust into precision. He noticed changes in himself, too. Sleep came more often, not always easy, but real. When memories surfaced, they did not knock him flat. He had a method now. He had a partner who stayed. Ranger, officially reinstated and certified, wore his new designation without ceremony. He did the work because it was the work, because it mattered. On a clear morning near the end of spring, Jack and Ranger stood at the edge of the training grounds forest, stretching beyond. Jack adjusted his gear, the movements smooth, practiced. Ranger waited at his side, weight-balanced, eyes forward. Jack took a breath and stepped off the pavement into the trees. Ranger moved with him, stride matching, no leash between them, just understanding. They disappeared into green shadow together, not as a man and a dog rescued from winter, but as a unit composed, capable, and ready. Jack did not look back. He didn't need to. He had arrived where he was meant to be. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes God sends them quietly through a life the world tried to discard, or a moment where choosing to stay changes everything. Jack and Ranger remind us that no one is beyond purpose, and no wound is unseen by him. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of courage and redemption. May God bless you and keep you safe.